thank you very much for joining us as well from wherever you are. And I would like to start our first panel. We have two great speakers from Kurdistan originally, if not otherwise, based in the UK. We have Dr. Choman Hardi, who's the scholar, poet, and translator. You might recall that she has actually translated a lot of poetry by the late poet Sherko Bekas into English, which is an amazing initiative. Dr. Choman's research and teaching interests include poetry, feminist literature, and feminist literary criticism, and gender and genocide, masculinity, and other, among other themes. And she is the founding director of the Center for Gender and Development Studies at the American University of Iraq, Suleimania. And it is through her and under her leadership that the Center for Gender Development Studies has started a very promising initiative that is basically the first interdisciplinary gender studies minor in Iraq. Like the students at the American University can take that course as a minor, but also the center is developing a gender studies curricula and program for other universities, colleges, and even, as I can recall, for high school and basic education in the Kurdistan region. And also we have Dr. Dara Salam, who is a teaching fellow at the my alma mater school in London, which is the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. And he has written intensively on Middle East politics, political theory, and also on the political situation in the Iraq and also in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And he has also authored and published a lot of journal articles and also books in Kurdish, if I remember correctly. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Choman Hardi. She has at least 15 minutes to present her talk, and we will later go to Dr. Dara al-Salam for another 15 minutes, and then we can take the question and answers for all the three speakers, for Mr. Karwan Tahir and also Dr. Choman and Dr. Dara afterwards. The floor is yours, Dr. Choman.
Thank you, Shivan, and thank you for organizing this, Bahar and Shivan together. This is a great initiative. I would like to start with where Karwan finished, the difference between the old generation of youth and new generation. I think one thing that we are seeing, I am probably part of the old generation because I was a teenager when all of this was happening. What we see the difference is if in the past the youth were willing to give their lives and spend years in prison for what they believed in with passion, we do not find the same passion and dedication for homeland anymore. And I think one of the major differences is probably the absence of hope, because in the past the youth had a lot of hope that their initiative, their work will change the system. Unfortunately, after 1992 and the creation of the Kurdistan regional government, a lot of disappointment followed for the youth in particular. Consolidated systems have this way of making people feel hopeless, whether it's a patriarchal system or an extreme capitalism or a corrupt system or dictatorship. They usually make you feel that no matter what you do, nothing is going to change. And I think the fact that young people in Kurdistan nowadays have been bombarded with this idea that there isn't much they can do as long as ongoing conflict, in their just recent years, we've had a conflict, the war against ISIS, which took 3 years to clear up, and also the conflict between KRG and Baghdad over oil, over the budget and so on, and the economic crisis following with oil, the Turkish bombardments, Iranian invasions. I mean, there has been endless conflict within conflict, internally and externally. And it's very easy for people to feel that there isn't much they can do because a lot happens that is outside their control and they cannot contribute to that. And as a result, also, because there are so many urgent issues that need dealing with, like livelihood, the fact that the economic crisis led to not paying salaries of civil servants for, every few months, every 4 to 5 months. That meant there's been protests among teachers and academics, for example, school closures and so on. This is before, of course, COVID. This has been going on for a few years. So in terms of access to opportunities, employment rates, private sector growth, all of that is looking very dim and depressing. So it's very easy. There's a Kurdish saying that says, hold on to your hat and hope that the wind won't take it. And that's what people are encouraged to do, that this is not going to shift. There's nothing you can do. There are corrupt people, unfortunately, in power at the moment. And there are many other external conflicts that contribute to the depression and economic crisis. And just look after your own interest. Don't bother, stay safe, stay cool, and don't do anything. So there's been a lot of hopelessness, and that's why a lot of youth energy, ideas, initiative is lost, as opposed to previous years under dictatorship, where the youth were willing to give up their lives, their precious years of their spending years in prison, being tortured, risking huge costs to themselves and to their families, immediate families and friends, and so on. And nowadays, much less so, because there's a lot of hopelessness. In my experience of, I lived abroad for 26 years and I have come back in 2014. Since 2014, I've been here at the American University of Iraq, Soleimani. And one of the things I started immediately was a student club called the Action Group. That was like a few months after I began working at AUIS. And the Action Group's aim was to tackle social injustice, address social inequality, and work for justice. And I want to take an intersectional approach. So we weren't just thinking about gender equality, we were also thinking about class inequality, disabled people's access to services, ethnic and religious differences, marginalization of people, the poor people, the disabled people, Yazidis, and so on. So I did this for 3 years, and we had 3 rounds of good leadership in the student club, and they did fantastic projects, and they even had fantastic ways of fundraising, ways that I would have never thought about. I usually think of traditional means of fundraising, but like for example, one of them organized a football match between faculty and students to fundraise. So the tickets sold, and he raised about $400 for a project with a deaf school in Soleimania. And they've done approaching businesses, approaching politicians, approaching different venues in order to fundraise for their social justice projects. All their work was voluntary. They spent several months, several students did this over the summer of 2016, where they were visiting the Hiwa Children's Cancer Hospital. All they did was they were playing music, they were reading stories, they were playing with the children, and sometimes the children obviously didn't trust them because every adult was either injecting them with medication or hurting them. So it took a lot of trust building for the students to be able to play with the kids and have fun with them. There were many projects that was led, but what I have found is youth could be mobilized. You could motivate them to work, and they do work. They just, if you excite them about a project, they take initiative and they take it further. But it does take a lot of work to get people to start and to follow through, because sometimes, unfortunately, these projects attract young people who are looking to fill in their CV with activities. I did this, tick, I did that. And you get a small group left over who are actually dedicated to this. But I want to lead on to very quickly to talk about the gender studies that Shivan kindly mentioned. One of the things I noticed, and it's obvious to all of us, obviously, is that whenever there are crises, economic, political, and otherwise, gender inequality always falls by the wayside. So whenever you talk about injustices related to gender, they always say, this is not the right time. There are more urgent issues. And in a way, gender inequality has become so systematic and it has become so invisible that most people don't even recognize it as a problem. They just think it as a product of biological differences between men and women. Men and women are different biologically. Women give birth, women breastfeed, women have to look after kids, and everything else is lumbered on this biological role of reproduction and breastfeeding. As a result, they conclude women should stay at home, there's no injustice, women should not be paid. Many other conclusions follow from this biological, and this conflating the notion of sex, which is biological, with the notion of gender, which is socially constructed. how gender roles and gender characteristics are actually built on the biological differences, and they create this system of inequality. And it becomes very hidden, very subtle. It's reinforced every way through our language. We use a lot of sexist language and also racist language, ableist language, a language that reproduces stereotypes, reproduces inequality, but also through our basic daily practices, through our perceptions of people, the opportunities we provide to people. And to get people in my first semester, when I taught this critical reading and writing course and gender and media course, and when I started teaching feminist literature, there was a lot of student protest. There were many people who complained that I am brainwashing people, that I am forcing them to, I wouldn't pass a student unless they agree that there's gender inequality. There was a lot of protest and a lot of, she hates men, she hates, she will only give good grades to the females and so on. And it took a couple of semesters for students to realize this is a systematic issue in our society that we need to tackle, because unfortunately they did not see it. They did not see that the fact that the KRG representative today, Kakarwan, for example, said Choman Khan to me and said Dr. Dara to Kak Dara, they don't see this as part of an extension of patriarchy, that women who have titles are deprived of it. They don't see it as an extension of patriarchy, that a woman walks into a room and nobody stands up, where a man walks in and they all stand up. They don't see it as oppression when women end up, I end up in a situation where there's a strange child and everybody looks at me to look after the child. I'm not very maternal. Why isn't one of the men doing it? So there are many ways that women and men are treated differently. Women's access, you can't take transportation safely in the night as a woman. You cannot travel alone as a woman. You cannot, many women are, young females are deprived of education in a different city because their families don't trust them. Whereas, families we see in private universities in particular, the female body is only 30% compared to 70% male. Why? Because families believe that investing in their son's education is more important, because he has to be the breadwinner in his family, but investing in female education is not, so she will get married and somebody will look after her. Whereas when it's free education in University of Suleimania, you see 50-50. So investing in your child's education, supporting your child through travel, work, and so on, all of these things. We've had students at AUIS, which is supposed to be the sort of middle class and upper middle class part of the society, where female students, when their parents find out that they have a relationship, love interest, then they are withdrawn from university. But that never would happen to a male student, for example. All these simple daily things add up together to a system of inequality that has become consolidated and invisible. So we started, when I started talking about the leadership of the university about setting up gender studies, this was, the Yazidi genocide had just taken place. There was the ISIS crisis still ongoing, the IDP refugee crisis. About 2 million IDP refugees were residing in Kurdistan region for about a year around that time. The economic crisis, the conflict with the central government. Everybody was saying, look, we are not going to develop a new program. We're hoping that we will keep our programs that are already existing, because there are low enrollments of students, there's economic crisis, and so on and so forth. So what I started doing was I started developing courses that are part of English department, but they have a feminist perspective. I was very lucky that other colleagues joined AUIS by accident who had an interest in gender studies, and they started developing courses. All in all, we ended up with 8 classes, and we went back to the university curriculum review committee and said, here we go, you have a gender studies minor and you haven't paid anyone for it, it's for free. And then, of course, the university celebrated this achievement. But we've had an experience with students who, obviously female students are much more open and understanding of gender inequality because they see it every day. They experience it themselves on a daily basis. They see that their male kin, male of the same age, male in the same family, have many more opportunities and have many more privileges than they do. It's more difficult for the male students to see it. Despite that, we've had enrollment of 15 students since we announced the gender minor in 2017, and 5 of them are male students. And we launched this Mr. Feminist campaign. We wanted to encourage this idea that feminism is not something that only women do. Anyone who understands gender inequality and works to address it, not just theoretically, not those who speak the good speech and then go home and treat their wives or sisters or female kin as less than themselves, but those who actually give up their privileges and fight for gender equality are also feminists. And my experience with this is that it's like dropping the sunglasses of this pink glasses that people wear that makes the status quo seem fine, seem normal, seem just and fair. And when they are educated about it, they see how much it's imbued with inequalities and injustices that they didn't see before. We've had a lot of feedback from students who talk about the same thing. I'm not going to take up more time, and I can talk about answer questions later, but I just want to sum up that it is possible despite all the obstacles, despite all the hopelessness. For example, people have resorted to voting, but voting there are voting frauds. They've resorted to demonstrations and protests, but a lot of times this is violently suppressed. They've resorted to a lot of media, complaining in the media and in social media, but it feels like nothing can be achieved. We are in a deadlock. But in fact, you can enthuse the youth. The youth have a lot of energy and power. They have a lot of interesting ideas that they can pursue, but at times they lack that role model that supports them. They don't know how to start and where to start from. Despite that, some young people have taken initiative, but many more feel hopeless and angry, and they don't know how to. I think anger is a very good thing. I, as a feminist, as a woman who started feeling oppressed in a patriarchal system, was very angry teenager. This anger could be utilized for good, because that's a lot of energy that you could utilize to get justice. And that anger should be utilized for justice. And at the moment, a lot of it is getting wasted. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choman Hardi, as usual. Really enjoyed your take. I would like to move to our next speaker without any further ado, Dr. Dara Salam, who is going to talk about the politics of youth, conflict, and social movements in the Kurdistan region. Dr. Dara, the floor is yours.
Shivan and Dr. Bahar. And also thank you to Dr. Choman for the very good talk. And I would like actually to probably talk a little bit about the issues surrounding the youth in Kurdistan, and pose the question as to what we mean by youth when we usually talk about this category. So how do we define the youth? So the question, I think, also, this question also will take us to consider other social strata that could be similar to the youth in their structure and social and political issues. For example, when we talk about women and gender, so I think that will actually connect with what Dr. Choman said. So speaking of the youth in the Middle East, or possibly actually in West and South Asia in general, has some significance. First, because it constitutes the largest demographic proportion throughout the region. And secondly, because it's the backbone of any political and social movement. And I think governments have to address the issues and concerns if they are to be stable. So as it might be methodologically inaccurate to define youth in a unified way, i.e. as a social class that can be categorized for the purposes of observation and inferences, it's important to use the category of youth for the sake of classification and clarification as a societal strata that can be defined by virtue of their distinctive social habitus and human capacities. So in a way, obviously that will take us to the question of intersectionality. So whether actually we can bring the youth as a unified social class, or actually we have young people from different backgrounds, from different social classes, and from obviously different genders. So these are the kind of the complications, or let's say the kind of intertwinement that actually happening when we talk about the youth. And I think for the sake of clarity, so we need to distinguish between these kind of units. So I think the logical division between old age and youth is one that's based on power. So it's a division of power, basically, where wisdom and power are assigned to the old elders who manage and rule, but assigning youthfulness and immaturity, i.e. irresponsibility, to the youngsters. So in this context, there's a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who argues that actually this division, which is principally a question of power, can be seen most clearly in the division between sexes and genders. So his argument is that the division between youth and old age is socially constructed. It's not a clear-cut division to demarcate the boundaries between ages and to tell who's young and who's of old age. I think that probably Dr. Choman will agree with this. So when we talk about, for example, genders, so basically, I mean, the distinctions, the subjugation of women, the discrimination is basically it's a question of power. It's a question of principally about power. So I think the same will apply to youth as well, especially in the Kurdish society, where the older generation are always dominating the political area. So there are obviously clearly significant differences within youngsters, as not all young people identify themselves with a specific ideal. There are class, gender identity, and perspective differences. In fact, they have different political worldviews and ideals that would make them respond in a different manner to the changes and events that happen in the world at the national and the global level. However, there are common grievances that bring youngsters together in their struggle to have their voices heard and to play a more visible role in the political, social, and economic life of society. In other words, the youth can be considered as social agents who engage in various activities, not necessarily political activities, but those that they identify themselves with as the youth's cultural and lifestyles, such as music, clothing, hairstyles, propensity to risk-taking, and high motivation for creative ways of thinking and bringing new ideas. I talked about the kind of population, so the youth population in Kurdistan and actually in the wider Middle East. Since this youth constitutes a large proportion, I think asking whether there is a causal relationship between youth bulge and the political unrest, protests, and conflicts in the Middle East is not an irrelevant and trivial question. So I think Kakaran mentioned a few figures from the Kurdistan statistics, and I think I would mention a few one for my purposes, actually to demonstrate that actually we have a problem. I'm afraid I probably disagree with Kakaran about the kind of rosy picture of today's political and social and economic situation in Kurdistan, and especially what's related to the youth. So if we just take, like, for example, I mean, we see that actually about 35% of the population is younger than 15 years, and 61% of the population is between 15 to 64. And according to the figure from the demographic survey conducted by the UN in 2018 on income and unemployment, 36% of households in Kurdistan earn less than $420. So that's 36%, and 51% actually earn between $420 and $835 a month. That's for a household. So we can tell that actually these are quite low earnings, and it's quite high proportions of households actually earning very, very less. And it seems, actually from this one can conclude how the kind of the economic disparity and the inequality is actually growing in Kurdistan as a result of loss of privatization, which is happening every day, and take education, take the public services like hospitals and, for example, electricity sector, which is now a very kind of heated topic. And also consider that, bearing in mind that actually about 65% of the population in Kurdistan are on the government payroll. So these are we can come back to this later on in the Q&A session. But in terms of defining the youth, so I believe that actually we can make a kind of separation in the Kurdistan region, especially after the 1991 uprising, which marks the emergence of the Kurdish entity, the autonomous Kurdish entity in Iraq. So probably I would say actually we have two generations from that date. So the 90s generation, which starts from 1991 up until 2003, so until the fall of Saddam's regime. And another generation, probably we'd say the mid-2000s generation, so it starts from 2003 until now. So because, I mean, we know that actually some kind of economic boom happened, especially after 2005. So the generation, the 90s generation, actually had a different experience. So these two generations did not live, obviously, this is important as well. I mean, these two generations did not live under Saddam's regime and has no experience of the amount of ordeal that the previous younger generation went through. However, they have an intimate relation with this experience through memory, everyday stories that their families and friends have narrated. They have lived through it, even though they never experienced it. Some of them were relatives, sons of daughters of those who were subject to the Anfal Halabja chemical attack and other war crimes inflicted on the Kurdish people. However, these generations differ from the parental generation in their political perspectives and approach towards social relationships, in that they do not compare the current Kurdish rule to the Saddam rule, as the parental generation used to do at the outset. In fact, the new generation no longer uses this or any kind of comparison to judge the efficacy and legitimacy of any system except the democratic parameters, according to which an institutionalized and democratic system of governance should be the aim. So what I would like now to do is actually to talk about how the youth can act in a way to bring themselves to a stage where they can feel that they are heard and make an impact. I think there are two ways in order to do that, or in order for the youth in Kurdistan actually to accomplish. One, the first route, I would call it as a non-political route. And this non-political route is actually through the work of the NGOs that aim at youth capacity building and providing opportunities to young women and men to participate in various community projects, which they can affirm themselves as young actors who can make changes at community levels. This process of charity works and NGOs, in which the majority of those involved are the youths, who find such working conditions, especially in foreign NGOs, seen as desirable and also privileged in comparison to other public sector workers. I say this process can be described as the depoliticization of the youth's main concerns and inclinations towards change and social transformations. So one of the problems with this massive influx and emergence of NGOs, especially foreign NGOs, charities and organizations that are centered on youth, women and others, is actually what's called the NGOization of politics and civil society. And in this particular context of the youth energies, by absorbing their revolutionary fervor and tendencies for change and channeling them into NGOs, professional works, and their set of policies, which are concentrated on managing crises rather than actually on change and encouraging civic protests. So this process of NGOization is happening not only in Kurdistan, but also in the wider Middle East, where there's a huge donor funding, for example, from World Bank, UN, and other foreign bodies to the NGOs, local and international, which are actually meant to strengthen civil society. But that's probably will take us to quite a longer debate about that. So this process, I argue, is actually enfeebles the opportunities for the emergence of social movements. So the NGOization tends to divert the youth's capabilities for protest and change of the status quo to something that's reduced to a dream of finding a job in these international NGOs. So this can be considered as the non-political route that the youth nowadays in Kurdistan find themselves in. But the second is a political route, which is essentially any political or social movement that arises to challenge the status quo and seeks to fix the current political system in Kurdistan. Young women and men are the driving force in any movement that erupts against the political elite demanding change and the overhaul of the system. As I think that would also connect with the point that raised by Kakarwan, that actually the youth were always and is always the engine of any kind of political parties and movements. But to what extent actually the youth capabilities actually being exploited, and to what extent actually the youth can find themselves in these kind of parties and organizations and social movements, if there is any, that their interests are represented. So I think at the moment, what's happening in the Kurdistan region is there's a tremendous amount of disillusionment with the political parties, especially with the two main parties, which has led to a huge despair towards the political system among young people. This sentiment has created a conviction that change cannot be achieved through ballot box. And it's for that reason the last election in Kurdistan recorded the lowest turnout. If the youth have lost hope that the political system cannot be changed through elections and voting, they will have to resort to other courses of action for their grievances to be heard. They will have to take to the streets to pour their anger at the system that perpetuates patronage networks through which positions and privileges are distributed to the inner circle and neglects young talents and capabilities which are not part of these networks. In fact, people in general and youth in particular have been protesting for years against the domination of the KDP and PUK over the political system. The lack of basic services like electricity, water, and salaries, and against unemployment that's widespread among young male and female graduates. The combination of this rapid growth of young population in Kurdistan and the lack of basic services and unemployment have led to constant and protracted conflicts between the ruling political elite and society at large. So I'll just quickly end with the kind of politics that we have at the moment in Kurdistan region. So I think this point probably was raised as well by Kakaran and Dr. Choman as well. So in the beginning of the political process of the Kurdistan region, which was led by the two main political parties, it was looked upon with some sympathy by people, and it was considered to be a process of democratic transition that started after 1991. this was meant to justify the KDP's and PUK's political and economic ills and deficiencies, in fact. And that obviously came to the realization only when, after a few years, that actually was not the case. So basically, this justification was soon to be turned on its head, and it no longer had any credibility within Kurdish society and among people. So to give a more accurate and fitting description of the political system in the Kurdistan region is to describe it in terms of party hegemonic system with authoritarian undertones. What drives the majority of young people to protest against the status quo, resort to political activism, getting involved in collective action and demonstrate on the street for a decent life is actually the politics of clientelism and nepotism that constitutes the structure of the political system and dries up the resources that should be preserved for younger generations. In fact, the fight of the current young generation is a fight for future generations in Kurdistan, who will take the political elite and present generation into account for all the lacks that they will have to suffer from. This clientelist system, which has been operating by KDP and PUK, ensures that their voters remain loyal and they make every effort to buy votes in return for positions and advantages. And in some cases, this is elicited through fear of expulsion and cut off salaries, as it is the case with police and security members. This has ensured that the two political elites remain in power. What's more shocking is that these two parties establish a hereditary succession that descends from the older political elite to the young sons and to the young sons to perpetuate their rules. Obviously, all this has created wide inequality among different sectors of society, especially among the youth. The resentment and frustration felt by the youth come as a result of the political system in place that cannot generate life opportunities for young girls and boys. More importantly, they come to the realization that their world will not open up unless this politics of clientelism and nepotism is completely eliminated. So up until now, the youth in Kurdistan have not been able to form a social movement away from political party polarization. As has been one of the main problems, actually, not only since 1991, but I think actually has been the case in the history of the Kurdish, in the political history of Kurdistan and Kurdish political parties. So because as you see, that in the formation of all political parties in Kurdistan, actually their main grassroots reliance was on the youth, especially the students. So in the modern days as well, the emergence of political movements like Goran, Change, and New Generation movements, the youth from the grassroots of the youth actually formed the grassroots of these movements, or they formed. And also in this case, actually the New Generation movement, even its leadership formed a form of young people. However, the main problem is that the majority of youth do not find themselves represented in these movements, as they are political parties charged with hierarchy and political interests. So they instead need to form their own fronts. The social movement that works as pressure groups on the government, a movement that's able to own the streets and public sphere and stage protest when the need comes. Another worrying phenomenon, which I would like actually to touch upon very quickly and leave for the Q&A session, is actually what's happening very recently is the kind of, we call silencing of peaceful voices in Kurdistan, which is quite worrying and is a kind of phenomenon which is not very promising actually for a region that its young people fought for many years and endured many ordeals and catastrophes for themselves and families. Take it from the Anfal, from the chemical attacks, from the clandestine works actually by young people and the older generation, but the older generation who were participant in these political parties are in power now. So the silencing of these peaceful voices, especially young journalists who find themselves increasingly pushed away by the two-party security apparatuses. Basically, I mean, these young journalists actually are kind of the critical voices, and they should be actually protected by the freedom of the press, by freedom of speech and expression, rather than actually being harassed, arrested, and jailed. And this actually shows to what extent the young voices are suppressed to quite a large extent if you are coming with a critical voice. And I think these are quite important points, I mean, to be discussed in this event. And I would actually believe that these points are important to highlight in order to understand the reality of the current situation. And also, if we realize these deficiencies, these big problems, then how can we, in a way, fix the problem or maybe fix the system in a more general sense? And I think I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dara, Dr. Choman, for your contribution. I just want to just quickly reflect on a couple of points that Dr. Dara said before I go and pick some questions from the panelists, from the participants that I have posed for the panelists. Two important things that were mentioned by Dr. Dara. One of them was election turnout. The last election that took place in the Kurdistan region was the parliamentary election of September 30th, 2018. And out of the 3.1 million eligible voters, only 1.8 or approximately 1.8 million people, or 58% of the eligible voters, turned out to the polls. And that's a sharp decline compared to the election that took place in 2013 for the parliamentary elections of Kurdistan. That was 74%. So the disillusionment is pronounced, and it's a sharp decline from 74% of election turnout in 2013 to 58% of turnout in 2018. And another point that Dr. Dara mentioned is about corruption. And that's very, very tricky, because the corruption analysis on Iraq does not disaggregate the results for the Kurdistan region from the wider or Iraq proper. So it's very hard to know the exact level of corruption in Kurdistan in specific terms. However, the KRI, according to the latest intelligence of the European Union intelligence, or also Transparency International on corruption, KRI scores only slightly better than the rest of Iraq or Iraq proper, and under the same EUI's corruption index. Basically, the index ranks 7 MENA countries, and UAE is coming at the top, and Iraq is at the bottom of the scale, and KRI is the 5th or closely behind Turkey and slightly above Iran and Iraq in this corruption perception index. Just to give a context of these two key dynamics in terms of disillusionment among the youth or turnout, and also corruption, I would like to not to take any more time, but actually go to the questions that we received from the participants. So basically, I will start with a question by Maria Kuppers that is basically addressed to the panel. So I would ask Dr. Choman, Dr. Dara, and Karwan to answer that. The question is, do the panelists believe that the recent changes in the electoral law, I believe last week in Council of Representatives in Baghdad, the establishment of smaller constituencies in all these Iraqi provinces could provide a window of opportunity for youth to participate and campaign in the next elections? Dr. Choman, and then Dr. Dara, and then Kakarwan.
I will revert to Dr. Dara on this one, if that's okay. I think it's, so far we've had this problem that sometimes with vote from one city, another city gets underrepresented. I don't understand the voting system very well, so I shouldn't comment on this one. I'll pass on.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's actually this new law, which is passed by the Iraqi National Assembly. I think it's quite an important one. And one of the main problems of the Kurdish electoral system is actually the whole Kurdistan is one district. So basically what's the new electoral system in which was passed by the Iraqi parliament, obviously, that had some problems because what's called the multiple districts. But we have a single district in the whole of Kurdistan. And actually, this is in the interest of the big parties, basically in the interest of the KDP and PUK, so that they remain the major parties. So in the electoral system of making it a plural, making it multiple districts, then you will have the opportunity for smaller parties and also for independent candidates to be able to put themselves forward actually for the candidacy, and this is quite important. I mean, in connection to what I was talking about in terms of social movements. So if the youth actually organize themselves, so they will be able as well to participate under that kind of system. But at the moment in Kurdistan, there is no law like the one which has been passed in the Iraq, because I mean the new one actually kind of created 83 districts at the moment for Iraq. So that will be a good sign actually if the Kurdistan parliament as well pass a law in order to make the electoral system plural rather than a single one.
Kakarwan Farmo.
Yes, Shivan. Well, thank you. I think this is a very important question. I myself, I always admire the election system here in Britain based on constituency. I mean, even sometimes the parties who get the majority of the vote in terms of the number of the total vote, they still lose in constituency. So the technique of how you deal with the these new system is very important. And I think for Kurdistan region, for Kurd, this is a new, it's a new system for all of us, but in particular for Kurdistan region, and we have to be very careful with it. It will affect the seats. But in my opinion, I think the Kurdish bloc, all of them in Kurdistan region, all political parties, they should have one list for the Iraqi parliament, and that's the only way we can beat this new system. Otherwise, it will affect us. Thank you.
Akshwan, if I may, I have a comment on the social movement, the distinction between social movement and NGOs, which was raised by Dr. Dara. I think in reality, although there are differences between social movements and NGOs, and we know that, and there is a reality of NGOization in general, but in reality, there are blurred lines. You will see that in Kurdistan, for example, many of the NGO staff, you have many passionate, dedicated NGO staff who are actually underpaid. You know, they don't have pension, they don't have holidays, and they work because they're passionate about the subject and they care. And these are the actors of change. And I think the other problem with this NGOization debate is sometimes we have a confusion about roles. I mean, the role of NGOs is not really to launch revolutions or bring about change. They are to provide services to those disadvantaged groups that the state or the central government or local government does not provide for. So as a human community, we do that. We have people who are in the margins and we try to bring them into the margin and help them. It's not their role to launch revolutions and social change. I think we need both. We need the NGO side that helps the unprivileged population, but we also do need social movement. But in fact, there are also many times when they are blurred, they are the same, they act in the same way.
Can I just add to what Dr. Choman said? Obviously, I agree with that there are some NGOs who work are very important, especially the human rights organization, and they have a quite good effect on the performance of government, especially in terms of the human rights violations. But there's a difference actually between NGOs and social movements. In terms of revolution, actually, it's not always about revolution, but also, I mean, for me, obviously, a revolution is not armed struggle. Revolution is when you change the perceptions. So, for example, the work you do actually is changing the kind of patriarchal perception in Kurdish society. So this in itself actually revolutionized the social status quo. So social movements definitely different from NGOs, because NGOs actually has a bureaucratic procedure and is actually kind of bound by certain set of policies which are imposed by the donors. So there's a huge difference, actually, I would say. And if you look at for example, the protests in Iraq, in Baghdad, and the other, I mean, the kind of social movement there is actually trying to do things, to work. So in Kurdistan, we need something like this. Actually, we need a social movement which can always own up to what they need to do. Actually, for example, whenever it's possible. I mean, protests or kind of civic disobedience. I mean, these kind of things actually is the work of social movement, not NGOs.
I mean, we need both, I agree.
I will go to another question. Thank you for your contributions. That's a question from Dr. Lana Askari. How do you see the role of Iraqi Kurdish youth in comparison to the wider Kurdistan region? And I think she refers to, obviously, Bakur, Rojava, and Rojhelat in relation to Bashur or other parts or other Middle Eastern countries. And that's the question to the whole panel, to Dr. Dara, Dr. Choman, and also Kakarwan.
If I may start, I think there's a huge difference between what's happening in Bashur and the other parts of Kurdistan, specifically because we are living after the liberation phase. I think in all the other parts, there's the striving for freedom, for liberation, for equality, and for constructing a different kind of society and system. One positive, fantastic thing that you see in Rojava and Bakur is integrating the gender struggle and class struggle into the national liberation movement. And that's what we didn't see in Iraqi Kurdistan. I think the question of who's a revolutionary in Iraqi Kurdistan, it was very simply whoever fights the Ba'athist nationalist system or dictatorship. And it did not integrate many of the social injustice issues. Some parties tried to, some parties were much more, they did it in a different way than it was done in Bakur, in the Kurdish movement in Rojava and Bakur are very different. But also because we are living post-liberation in Kurdistan, Iraq, and there is a lot of disillusionment with the KRG, with corruption, with nepotism, with lack of opportunities for youth. Youth involvement is very, very different from youth involvement amongst those who are fighting for their identity, fighting to say, I'm Kurdish and I have a right to speak my language and to exist and to practice self-rule. So they are very, very different. I see youth involvement a lot higher and more effective and more effectively managed, and more many of the social justice causes integrated into the youth cause than you would see in our case.
Yeah, Shivan. Well, I agree with Dr. Choman. Forgive me last time, Dr. Choman. My apology. I know you just wanted to make a general point, but it's happened. No offense were meant. I agree with Dr. Choman on the perception of the youth in Bashur, Rojava, and Bakur, Rojava, and Roshalat. I think they are at the stage one of what we've been through, the stage that I talked about, the struggle for liberation, democracy, freedom of speech, and all that. However, if we look at their youth in diaspora, they are very active. They engaged politically. There are a lot of cooperation between youth in all parts of Kurdistan diaspora, and that is something which is very promising.
Okay, so if I don't know, I mean, my take on this might be a bit different. I mean, in terms of, I mean, especially when you take the comparison between the Kurdish youth in Kurdistan region and other parts of Kurdistan and in the Middle East, because I think Lana Askari's question is actually about the Middle East as well. So I think one point which is quite important, and probably most of you will agree, that actually nowadays the Kurdish youth in Iraqi Kurdistan actually no longer are very kind of obsessed with Kurdishness. So they do not identify themselves as engaged in Kurdiety. And this is actually a kind of, whether we call it a decline or a kind of as a result of the disillusionment with the political system. Yes, I would say yes, it's as a result of the disillusionment with the whole political system now in place in Kurdistan region. And this, I think also there was a study, actually, an empirical study conducted, can't remember the writers, but it was published about 2 years ago. Actually, it was a kind of investigative study of the Kurdish youth in Iraqi Kurdistan. The majority of young people do not care about Kurdishness, about Kurdiety, about Kurdbun. So the main worries is about actually other issues, as we said, like the corruption, the nepotism, the kind of patronage networks in place. So basically the political system, and obviously, I mean, that comes down to economic and social problems. So, and then this is one thing, and I will not add to what has been just said, actually, in terms of Rojava and Bakur. Obviously, there are differences. I mean, the youth in Rojava and Bakur are probably driven by more revolutionary fervors, depending on the context, the political context.
So basically, in a nutshell, you are saying that there is a shift from identity-based politics to issue-based politics, such as, for example, socioeconomic grievances, job opportunities, or services, etc., which basically reflects the more or less similar dynamics that are at play at the wider context of Iraq, which basically has been sparking popular protests in the recent years. While we are at this issue-based politics, we have a question from Bahan Jafar for Dr. Choman. And the question is, how do you evaluate youth participation in politics with regards to gender balance? And I believe this is, she refers to basically the women's participation in all the arenas, including the political sphere.
This is a tricky question because basically, I think how the KRG and many other people understand gender equality or, involvement of women in politics is that you just add a few women into the soup and stir. So it's about equality of numbers. So they're adding 30%. You have the 30% quota, which means there are, these women in the parliament, and they think that the job is done. But the problem with that is just the fact that somebody is a woman does not mean that they represent other women or actually have their interest in mind or even understand patriarchy. Some of the women, actually we can say safely, the majority of the women who are chosen for these positions are selected based on party loyalty and tribal connections, family connections, martyrs, of the previous revolution, and not because of their capability, knowledge, and specifically because of their role in gender justice or advocating women's rights. As a result, many times these opportunities, this 30% is still very little. It should be 50%, but this 30% quota is wasted because of ineffective leadership from the women. And unfortunately, we have this culture where if somebody becomes an MP, they think they are beyond or above seeking advice from others. Whereas what could have happened if a woman, because of her political connection, makes it to this sensitive and important post, she could build a bridge with the women activists and academics and NGOs that are working on the ground to educate herself and to better inform herself on how to, make sure that policy, laws, implementation, all the things that are going on are gender sensitive and they represent women's interests, not only male interests. That opportunity is lost. And I reiterate, it's not about numbers, it's about the numbers, yes, but also the right people in these places. And of course, we need a higher percentage. We find a lot of women that end up being interested in politics for the wrong reasons, not because they're passionate about bringing women's voices into politics. But I think if you don't have the consciousness yourself and the knowledge, obviously you're not going to reflect it in your work, unfortunately.
Yeah, just one comment on Dr. Choman's about gender. We in Kurdistan Regional Government and our representation, we have funded a scheme with Bristol University, between Bristol University and Sulaymaniyah University. They established a gender center in Sulaymaniyah University to educate people and to set up policies in that regard of genderism. Just wanted to mention that for the panelists. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but I'm sure you are.
Thank you. If I just quickly say something about that. Yes, that center was established in 2011, first with British Council funding and later with the KRG funding. And I think it's a great initiative to start. But the problem with it is we don't have gender studies in this region anyway. We don't have scholars who have PhDs and MAs in gender studies. So you are providing these, and the KRG, of course, the Ministry of Higher Education recently issued a decree in August 2018 to open gender studies centers in all of Kurdistan's universities. Now there are more than 30 centers, so every university has one. The question that I would ask is, what resources are you providing these gender centers? Do you give them any translations of gender studies texts that they could teach? Do you give them a budget where they can organize workshops? Do you actually develop the capacity of the professors who are suddenly lumbered with this post? They may be sociology professors or history professors, but they don't have a background in gender studies. Gender studies, like any other field, has its own theories, its own concepts, it has a history, and you cannot, just because it's about equality between men and women, it doesn't mean anyone can teach it. So yes, the right decisions are made, but the capacity building and resource support that goes with that is missing.
The next question is basically addressed to Dr. Dara and also Kakarwan, which is, I think it's about the role of non-governmental organizations or civil society as a mediating role, or to be an intermediary between youth strata and also the government. Like, to what extent, if I understand the question correctly, to what extent the NGOs and civil society has been able or successful in actually carrying out that mediating role between the youth in Kurdistan and the ruling authorities or the government authorities and functions. Kakarwan first and then Dr. Dara.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. As I said in my speech, we in the Kurdistan Regional Government, we have and we make a right decision and right policies. So we lay grounds, appropriate grounds for the youth to explore in politics and have a great contribution in all sectors of life. And as I said, empowering youth is partly on them and the other part on the governing system. I think we in the Kurdistan Regional Government, we fulfilled our part, and the other part is on the youth themselves. Also, there are many youth organizations established in Kurdistan region that they are contributing to their society, to changing in society. They are contributing in politics, economy, and all that. So all these organizations that been established in Kurdistan region are beneficial and contributing in changing the mindset of the youth in Kurdistan region on the way they perform. Thank you.
Okay, to answer that question, I mean, this is a very good question by Bahan. And I think in order to understand the work of NGOs, so when we talk about NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, so basically the NGOs are acting as civil society associations or organizations. So they are not receiving funds. They should not receive funds from the government. And their work is a kind of a middle ground between the government and society. So kind of civil society where they put pressure on the government or monitor the performance of the government. So the NGOs in Kurdistan, I mean, it's a complicated picture because there are so many associations, so many organizations, which are actually basically created by the political parties, mainly by the KDP and PUK and even the smaller political parties. So these are also called NGOs, but they are actually doing, I don't want to say doing nothing, but they are not doing the job of the proper civil society associations, which they have to monitor and put pressure on the government and to be the critical voice on the performance of the government. And in terms of the second part of the question, whether actually the NGOs succeeded in delivering the demands of the youth, I would say, I mean, we cannot give a total answer. I mean, there are good NGOs, obviously, local NGOs, I would say, very good ones, which work in different areas. For example, in the area of gender, in the area of election law, in the area of delivering different services to disabled people, to other sectors of society. So there is not a kind of overarching answer to that, whether actually the NGOs failed or succeeded. But I think the most important thing is that actually the youth have to be more engaged in a kind of either NGOs or social movements. I think that's the most important thing actually, in order to put more pressure on the work of government.
Thank you very much, Karwan and Dr. Dara. I think it's we are already 17 minutes behind the schedule, and I think everybody deserves a rest after 1 hour of really good discussion and engagement from our speakers and also the participants. I think all in all, from both Mr. Karwan Tahir, who talked about, or he gives us an overview of the socio-historical context of Kurdistan region, and also Dr. Choman, who talked about agency, or specifically the youth agency at the age or times of hopelessness and for the youth of Kurdistan region, and also Dr. Dara Salam, who he talked about the politics of youth and conflict and social change in Kurdistan region. I think we have had a very good first hour or panel discussion about these dynamics, and hopefully in the second panel we will build on these discussions and conversations that we have had in the first part of today. But now I think everybody deserves a very hard-earned break, and we will meet again for the second panel, where my colleague Dr. Ibrahim Malazada will come back with you with 3 also great speakers. Thank you very much again.